Last Summer in the City by Gianfranco Calligarich, translated by Howard Curtis, narrated by Mark Meadows. The first great disaster to befall mankind was not the flood, but the drying out. Shandor Ferenczi. As he rose and fell, he passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. T.S. Eliot. Forward by André Aciman. Last Summer in the City by the Italian novelist, playwright and screenwriter Gianfranco Calligarich was first published in 1973. He had arrived in Rome in his early 20s as a correspondent for a small newspaper based in Milan, and not much later, when recalled to Milan by the paper, decided instead to stay in Rome to devote himself to a novel, probably his plan all along. When finished, however, the book was turned down by every Italian publisher until dropping into the hands of one of Italy's most renowned writers and essayists, Natalia Ginzburg. She read it overnight, and her response was so enthusiastic that she got the publishing house Scazzanti, which was initially underwhelmed by the novel, to publish it. 17,000 copies were sold that summer, earning the young author a succès d'estime as well as a book prize. But not much later, the novel disappeared from the shelves and could be found only in scattered bookstalls and second-hand bookstores around Italy. Copies, however, were vigorously coveted by book lovers and reading groups, including some doctoral students, and the novel became the object of a cult among the literary cognoscenti. Then, nearly 4 decades later, in 2010, the prestigious small publishing house Nino Aragno Editore decided to reissue Last Summer. Deemed once again a highly crafted and serious novel, it was reviewed to great acclaim, with many critics openly kicking themselves for neglecting Calligarich's work when it was first published. But once again, and despite being reviewed by almost all of Italy's main dailies, the novel dropped from sight, only to be finally re-released in 2016 by Bompiani, as well as by a number of international publishing houses. Calligarich is not a familiar Italian surname. It has Slovenian and Serbo-Croatian roots, and, like many surnames ending in "ich," is frequently claimed by Italo-Slovenians whose lineage most likely goes back to the port city of Trieste. Many Italians continue to keep the Slavic surnames without necessarily feeling any connection to a Slavic ancestry. But Gianfranco Calligarich's origins are more complex. He was born in Asmara, Eritrea, once a thriving Italian colony. His father, who was born in Corfu to a Greek mother and a Triestine father, was Jewish, while his wife was Piedmontese. Gianfranco himself grew up in Milan, then moved to Rome, and yet, as he claimed in an interview, his roots are planted in Trieste, where he would most likely want to be buried. His extended family feels drawn to Trieste, dreams Trieste, feels Trieste, and ultimately claims to belong to no place but Trieste, even if many of its members may never have set foot there and wouldn't begin to understand the Italian spoken by native Triestini. His grandfather's life is worthy of a tiny epic, since the man, born with Slavic roots, moved from Trieste to Corfu, married a Greek woman, and later, on being branded a deserter by the Austro-Hungarian army during World War I, fled on the first ship he found, landed in Italy, and settled in Milan. On his deathbed, or so the story goes in Last Summer in the City, Calligarich's grandfather, who had travelled the seas in his younger days and whose mind was already drifting to a sea-girt Trieste of memory, asks his son to let him taste some seawater. Though the request may seem strange, coming as it did in landlocked Milan, his son, in Calligarich's novel, has no choice but to get in his car and drive all the way to Genoa with his 14-year-old son, whose brooding silence seems to have become the norm. The boy's father finally reaches the sea, fills up a bottle with water, and drives all the way back to Milan, only to find his dying father already unconscious. Still, the dutiful son, who could very well be Gianfranco's father, daubs his father's face with the salty water, even if the dying man is past caring or being grateful for the gesture. Seawater is not in the slightest insignificant, since Leo Gazarra, the narrator of the novel, who at times could probably be a stand-in for the author himself, will choose to leave Milan and move to Rome, in good part because of its proximity to the beach. There are, in the novel, numberless times when, on a lark, the narrator will hop in his car and drive for a good half-hour to the sea. Trieste, after all, faces the sea, and finding the sea anywhere on the planet remains, in more ways than one, a form of homecoming for the narrator. His Triestine grandfather found closure by asking for seawater, and, 15 years later, at the age of 30, Leo will too. Diving into the sea or just walking along the shoreline remains a source of undiminished bliss and purifying solace for Leo, a moment when his persistent penury, failures, defeats, and the unyielding solitude that he struggles to flee as obstinately as he keeps seeking it out are all summarily wiped off by a sudden plunge under water, an instance of physical and spiritual redemption that this young man is unable to find elsewhere. I dived in and swam until I was out of breath. Then I turned and played dead, listening to the swish of the water around my ears. I felt good. I couldn't remember ever feeling that good. This, in many ways, could be the very best that life has to offer Leo Gazarra. He fritters away his days and nights in Rome, on sleepless hours with Arianna, or in tumultuous all-night benders with his pal Graziano, while all he's desperately trying to do is reshuffle the worthless cards that life has dealt him. In this, as so many critics were all too quick to point out, he is the incarnation of Marcello Rubini of La Dolce Vita, 1960, and now, with the wisdom of hindsight, of Jep Gambardella of La Grande Bellezza, 2013. Both films are about the aimless lives of well-heeled journalists whose careers were taken over by worldly ambitions when, in truth, their deeper vocation was literature, a dream destined to be perpetually postponed, if not altogether shelved. As colourful as Marcello's life may seem, the shallow itinerary of his day-to-day is a perpetual skidding from one woman to another, one nightclub after another, one gathering, one soirée, one person to the next. Gambardella's itinerary is hardly different. Clearly inspired by Fellini's classic from 50-plus years earlier, Sorrentino's The Great Beauty is a far less sombre portrait of the decadent lifestyle of the privileged few, and reflects an Italy that moved on following its startling post-war boom of the early 60s, then survived the anni di piombo of the 70s and 80s, the years of lead, when Italy faced an endless assault of political carnage that eventually claimed the life of Prime Minister Aldo Moro in 1978, only to come out as elegantly disenchanted and unflappably put together, but no less feckless and disaffected than the 60s Rome of Fellini's speckling Via Veneto. As Jep chastises Stefania in the famous balcony scene, "We're all on the brink of despair." This never changes. It sits on every page of Calligarich's novel. His characters, unless gainfully employed or blinkered by upward mobility, sit on the brink of despair, condemned, as each is, to a staring contest with the abyss, sensing all along that the abyss is winning. What holds them together, what feeds and enables their internal atrophy, is Rome itself. The Rome of the early 70s is not just a city with famous sites and monuments, most of which are to this very day still begrimed by age and neglect. Rome is where almost everyone in last summer charts his or her circuitous transit through a city that, despite claiming a historic